everyone. My name is Svetla Turnin and I'm the co-founder and executive director of Cinema Politica. Tonight's event is the second event in our fall 2020 series of virtual screenings and live stream discussions about radical political film. We hope our events can help you stay engaged and inspired until we can gather and celebrate activist cinema once again in the theaters. In the meantime, you can check out our offerings on our Cinema Politica on-demand platforms, sign up for our newsletters, and follow us on social media so that we can keep you informed about upcoming live stream events and online screenings. Tonight, we begin this event by acknowledging that Cinema Politica's main office is located on the unceded lands of the Ganyengehaga Nation. We believe it is not enough to acknowledge the title holders of the lands where we live and work. Rather, we urge everyone who attends our screenings and live stream events to become involved in anti-colonial and indigenous-led struggles and resistance in Georgiage and beyond. Tonight, we're hosting our event on the Zoom platform, which is headquartered on Muwekma Uloni territory. We acknowledge indigenous stewardship, presence, and sovereignty beyond land and into these virtual spaces as well. Now, a quick breakdown of tonight's event. We'll start off with brief introductions, and then our guests will engage in a conversation about the film and their work for about 30 to 40 minutes. After this, we'll open the floor for questions from the audience. So we invite you all to send in your questions via the webinar or in the comments on YouTube and Facebook, where we're also live streaming the event. Tonight's discussion is, of course, inspired by the wonderful documentary, There Is No Place Like This Place, ANYPLACE, by director Lulu Wei, which premiered at Hot Docs this past spring, and it's making the rounds and it's attracting audiences the world over. Thinking about this creative and playful film title, I'm reminded as an immigrant of the fact that the notion of home is at once something many of us take for granted, while others struggle to find a home to call their own or to be safe and secure in. While the word also points to much more than a roof and four walls, home is a place where we feel at home. This includes neighborhoods, towns, and cities, even countries. The spaces, streets, shops, cultures, people, and environments where we find community, kinship, and sanctuary. These spaces and places are almost always under some kind of threat. And in Lulu Wei's documentary, that threat comes in the form of gentrification. With this in mind, we're delighted to have guests with us tonight who can speak to these issues explored in the film. And I'm sure we'll all agree that home is always a place worth fighting for. And now, a couple of words about our guest speakers. Lulu Wei is a Toronto-based director and cinematographer. She holds an MFA in documentary media from Ryerson University, and her work explores themes of urbanization, cultural identity, and queerness. Her debut feature documentary, There's No Place Like This Place, ANYPLACE, premiered at Hot Docs Canadian International Documentary Festival in 2020 and won a Rogers Audience Award. Her films and installations have been screened and exhibited at various festivals such as Doxa, Images Festival, Calgary International Film Festival, and Inside Out Film Festival. Shazma Abdulla is a writer, podcaster, and community organizer who focuses on social inequalities, racial justice, and spatial justice. She was the co-creator and co-host of a Montreal-based podcast called The Ethnic Vote, which tackled current political issues from a POC and queer perspective. She studied environmental studies at York University, and tonight she'll also moderate the first part of tonight's discussion. Aaron Vansintjan is a PhD candidate at Burbank, University of London. His research focuses on how community wealth, especially food culture and food habits, become transformed, eroded, and commodified through the gentrification process through a study of neighborhoods in Montreal and Hanoi. He is co-editor of Uneven Earth, a website on environmental politics, and his work also focuses on issues such as radical urban democratic movements, equitable degrowth, and urban political ecology. Aaron is also involved with the Park X anti-eviction mapping project, who are also co-presenting tonight's event. And you can read more about them at antievictionmontreal.org. And now I am beyond thrilled to welcome our guests. Thank you so much for all being here tonight. And I'll hand it over to Shazma for the first part of our discussion.
Thank you, Svetla. I'm so pleased to be here and so pleased to be discussing this really important film that Lulu has created with her team. First, I want to say thank you to the Cinema Politica team for having us. This is a really important conversation to be having, particularly in this moment. And really looking forward to your questions from the audience. So come prepared. As soon as we're ready to go, we'll take on your questions and have a good discussion, hopefully. So I'll go ahead and just sort of speak a little bit about the themes and the importance of this film to me, just to frame the conversation. So I'm originally from Toronto. I grew up in Toronto. So Honest Ed's is absolutely a landmark, or was, in that space. And I know this block quite well. And it was a huge loss. And I think, Lulu, you've done a wonderful job of showing how important this space was to that community and the history of this community in Toronto. From a queer and BIPOC perspective. So thank you for sharing that, and thank you for kind of sharing that personal journey of yours. As I said, I think this is a really important conversation for us to be having as we're facing a housing crisis across the country, as we're in the midst of a pandemic that is potentially crippling financially to many folks. And I think the film is a reminder, or the themes that sort of it brings through are those themes of loss and resistance, but also of survival and resilience and belonging and asserting and claiming our space in the places we live. So it really resonates, I think, this story, and stories of gentrification or revitalization really speak to folks, especially of our generation, I think of a millennial generation. I know, speaking from experience, having resided in Toronto and also in Montreal, and now I live in Ottawa, all times as a renter, you always have that anxiety in the back of your mind about being reno-evicted or kind of being displaced because of forces around you that you feel out of your control. So again, thank you for sharing that journey of yours, Lulu. It can't have been easy, but again, a really important story to tell. I wonder if you can speak a little bit more towards the importance to you of telling this story from your perspective as a queer person of color, and what's the importance, do you think, kind of on a larger scale, to tell these stories from the perspectives of these bodies that maybe are not viewed as belonging in these spaces, or potentially viewed as being disposable in these?
Thank you so much for having me, Cinema Politica. I'm so excited to get this discussion going, because that's one thing that I really miss about not being able to screen this at a theater in person and have these live discussions, and just being able to get to talk to both of you is just so nice to actually start a discussion about this. And thank you so much for your wonderful words about the film and how it resonated with you. You brought up so many points that I had hoped to get across, and so I'm really glad you were able to tell me about what you thought. And yeah, I guess, as like a queer person of color, I guess I make things through my own lens and my perspective, and I want to take up space. But I think when I was making this film, I never thought about it as like a film that I was making that I was like, oh, it's going to be like queer and it's going to have all these different things that I want to explore. For me, I was like, oh, this is like a redevelopment issue. And then I didn't want to be in the film, but everything was sort of unfolding around me, and including like when my building got sold to the developer, I was like, oh shit, like I actually have to move now. And the story is impacting me more directly than it was before. And then I was like, oh, I guess like I can also represent sort of this like group of millennials and people who are often renting, and then we get rent evicted, and just trying to find a new space kind of thing. But I like how I was able to be a part of it and just sort of maybe give more representation to queer BIPOC people, but also like queer relationships that aren't necessarily like coming of age stories. And it's just like, we've been together for a long time and we're dealing with a stressful move, and you know, nothing exciting to see here kind of thing. But I am just really happy that I was able to tell the story, and was given the opportunity to tell the story.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think certainly that kind of normalcy of our lives comes through in that film, and that's a really important achievement, I think. Erin, I said earlier that this story resonates, and I spoke a little bit about my experience, not in detail perhaps, although I probably could, about my experience in Montreal, and I'm sure other folks who live in Montreal have a similar experiences of potentially being displaced or trying to find new homes, or moving and then sort of seeing the city change. Especially when it comes from a rental rate perspective, or that kind of thing. I'm wondering, Erin, through your work, through your research, or through your work with the ParkX anti-eviction project, or anti-eviction mapping project, did you see any parallels? Did you see anything that is happening in Toronto that came through the film that we can relate to what's happening here in Montreal?
Yeah, for sure. Definitely the kinds of stories that you told, Lulu, made me think a lot about the people who I've talked to in Park Extension, where I was living up until 2 months ago. Now I live a block away. But also made me think of stories people's experiences that they've shared, in my research, also in St. Henry in Montreal, and also in Hanoi, where I was. The kind of way that eviction and the destruction of a place can really just shatter a community, but it's not just only a negative, in the sense that what I really loved, Lulu, that you did was showing how people are trying to respond to these changes in their life, and that it's not just that they are helpless victims, but that they're really fighting. For example, the bookstore owner, how she just had this amazing energy going into the future, even though much of her life's work was literally demolished, I guess. Yeah, so I really loved that. In terms of maybe like more the broader connections, Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver, all big cities in North America are facing massive investment in real estate. And that's a global phenomenon. 60% of all capital today is invested in real estate, which is a very big difference from, let's say, 50 years ago, where most capital investments were in industry or mining, things like that. But now there's just such a speculative bubble in urban construction, And I think that's like pretty important to contextualize in that there's just such a glut of money going around, which is what is making, what is the drive behind these huge development projects. And so in Montreal, I think in the last 10 years, what we've started seeing is, you know, already 10 years ago, the city became extremely involved with development projects, and the provincial and federal government, where these start, it wasn't just kind of a process of individual developers deciding we want to buy this and develop it. It was really an orchestrated process with the city as well. And one thing that your film made me think of was the Cartier De Spectacle, which is, you know, now this neighborhood, a district of spectacles in Montreal that was planned as a way to, you know, host festivals, museums, all that kind of thing. But the ironic thing was that they actually demolished a huge amount of already existing venues, and still a lot of music and like community spaces are being pushed out in that area. So it's maybe like, it's not the same story, but it's something where it was this kind of top-down development that really was tied up with the artistic, with this artistic creative vision of trying to create a more creative city. But now also in Montreal, I think another really extreme example is what we've been facing in Park Extension, which is this new, part of it is this new campus of the University of Montreal, which the city basically had a large tract that was a train exchange, and they sold the land to the university for almost nothing, which then the university started developing into a campus, which opened a year ago now, a bit over a year ago. But tied to that, the federal government gave $200 million in funding to develop an AI headquarters. There's a new Microsoft HQ as well. And that is all happening basically on the border of Park Extension, which is the most diverse city in Montreal for sure, and also it's a diverse neighborhood in Montreal, and for sure it's also lowest income neighborhood. So a very large, significant South Asian community is seeing a lot of evictions and displacement. And that's, yeah, that's something that that kind of extremely large development, you know, you might think, oh, well, it's happening in this place where no one was living, but it does end up affecting the surrounding areas, because you have these very, very strong communities that have developed in a neighborhood like Park Extension, and as the real estate prices go up, it makes it more desirable for landlords to renovate and to kick out their tenants and to get more high-income tenants or to sell their buildings and things like that. So yeah, just so that's one way that kind of what some things that are happening here in Montreal and some of the similarities. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's kind of something that I was struck by as well. I mean, there's a longer story of gentrification in Toronto, certainly, and revitalization in Toronto. that is maybe not kind of the purview of this film, but certainly feeds into that overall discussion, right? And I think gentrification is one of those sort of polarizing discussions in some circles. It's very complex. It takes on different forms, and I think the commonality tends to be that we see displacement of mostly of lower income, of people of color, Black and Indigenous people who have historically been able to live in these neighborhoods because they have been deemed as undesirable up to a certain extent in some cases, or just and now sort of are seeing this revitalization, right? So this narrative of these neighborhoods being blight or in need of revitalization, in need of economic development, and then these forces sort of conspiring to make that happen. And then this narrative of, well, it'll be good for the neighborhood. And I think that a lot of that conversation happened in the early days of the redevelopment of Mirvish Village as well. I think that there was, in some circles, in some planning circles, there was some hope that this would be a really great project because they wanted to keep the character of the neighborhood. And I think that the danger in these conversations is always that we're being pushed by market forces, right? And market forces don't always take into account people's lives, or some people's lives, certainly. So, so we always have to be nuancing these conversations and telling these stories of what the impacts and effects of these influxes of money and development are on our lives. So thank you for that. For that kind of insight, Erin, and drawing that parallel, because we're in a Montreal context, so it's good to know. And just for the audience's kind of knowledge, in Montreal we're seeing a historically low rate in terms of vacancy, so it's increasingly more difficult to find an apartment if you are a renter and you're having to go farther out. And there's some nuances in this number, but I think it's around 1.5. Or so, kind of as a global vacancy rate. That's very low, that's crisis level. So just to contextualize this conversation. Just to touch a little bit on something that you said, Erin, about creative cities and this kind of creative space. Lulu, I found it so interesting that you chose to tell the story centering art and artists, given the history of Mirvish Village. And kind of positioning artists as the storytellers and the story keepers of a space and of these communities. I think that there's often a narrative around artists when it comes to gentrification, right? So, you know, artists kind of move into, the typical narrative is an artist will move into a space, they'll sort of make the space, engage in acts of placemaking, this kind of thing, and sort of bring their art to the space and sort of breathe life into it in those ways. They become these sort of cultural hotbeds. And then as these spaces become more attractive, they kind of are positioned as ripe for gentrification or redevelopment, right? And then those artists themselves who have contributed to these spaces, as well as the people that have historically lived there in the generations of kind of immigrants in some cases that have lived in these neighborhoods, end up being displaced. And I think that comes through so elegantly in the film, and the history of you know, the Bloor-Bathurst area. That's the right intersection, right? Bloor-Bathurst, yeah, thanks. It's been a while since I've been in Toronto. I'm interested to learn a little bit more about, you know, I know you're an artist, so of course that choice makes sense, but can you speak a little bit more to that choice that you made to tell it from an artist's perspective a little bit? And if you can maybe think a little bit too about, I don't know if you've had this conversation, but that nuance of also art as business and the commodification of art spaces, as Erin was speaking to, with regard to Cartier De Spectacle, and sort of creating these spaces and then having these potentially negative impacts I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about that, and maybe Erin, you can jump in too based on your experience that you've seen.
Yeah, so Mirvish Village was an artist colony, and it's really funny how it sort of developed, and I think it kind of can mirror, you know, our future if we have any say in it. In that it was actually supposed to be a parking lot because Honest Ed's caused so much traffic that I think the city at the time was like, you have to do something about it, and so. Ed Mirvish was going to put in a parking lot to sort of solve that problem. But then I think a new alderman had come in and was like, you actually can't demolish like all of these buildings. And so his wife was an artist. So he was like, oh, I guess like, you know, she needs a studio because Yorkville in Toronto, which is like the bougie area, it used to be like the hippie commune, artist commune area before it became bougie and filled with like Louis Vuittons, etc. That had just sort of got, I guess, changed up, and was getting redeveloped. So he was like, okay, I'll just make an artist colony for my wife, kind of thing. And so I think it's just so interesting to take a look back at that and be like, how are we planning our cities, and how are we gonna decide like the future of our cities? Like we could end up with a parking lot or like an amazing artist colony. And like which one do we want, kind of thing. And even, you know, seeing that like the city can switch from like build a parking lot to like, no, you can't tear down these buildings, and the power they have, it's I find it so fascinating. And it was really hard to sort of decide on who to follow, because I talked to so many people, and a lot of the people are artists on the block, and then there's also like, you know, like restaurant owners and this like amazing Palestinian community center that was on the block too, called Beit Zatoun. And so it was just hard to sort of figure it out. But I just found Gabor, who's like 86 now, to be such an interesting person. And he gave me so much access, and he was just so like open to talk about like his life experiences and how that really contrasted with like Aita, who owned the bookstore, and her sort of like, you know, sort of getting a seat at the table and sort of like getting to stay. And so I sort of focused on him as like not a foil, but as another narrative that way. But I think, you know, like having an artist colony, like that drew me to like telling the story of these artists, because, you know, these spaces aren't really readily available. And I don't think there are many affordable artist spaces in Toronto, and like, you know, a lot of them are being slowly redeveloped. And yeah, like even if you in Toronto, at least if you look at like Sterling Street where the Mocha is now, it really feels like I'm like, oh, this is amazing. They took this old automotive like plant and they turned it into like the Museum of Contemporary like Canadian art. But then it's like, oh, I think there's like a whole redevelopment happening there. And it just feels like, you know, they want to make this area that used to have some artist spaces into like this arty, like, you know, cool place to live for this redevelopment. And so, yeah, it's like interesting, the commodification of like artists and the cool factor and like the whole like art washing of redevelopments, because developers, you know, part of like the community benefits thing is like, they hire artists, a lot of times not Canadian artists, like to build all this like art to make it like look nice. And it's just so interesting because the hoarding on Mirvish Village is, you know, like artists who created that thing. And it's, that to me is just like this interesting idea of art washing. And if you look into West Bank, the developer, they had an art show in Vancouver called The Fight for Beauty, I think it was, which is something that I feel like people should Google it and see how interesting that was. So yeah, I guess my focus on artists was because there's so many amazing artists there, and yeah, artists I guess are the beginning of gentrification in a lot of spaces.
Aaron, did you have anything that you wanted to add to that at all?
Yeah, it just reminds me of when I was living in, well, also I just wanted to say how much I really loved how much you followed Gabor around and how much we learned from him and heard from him. I thought he just, yeah, it just is just, I felt really grateful to meet him through your movie. In some way, and yeah, when I lived in London, there was a very large social housing building that all the residents were being evicted from, with the argument that they needed to redevelop the building, and in the UK, social housing gets managed by these like councils, which are increasingly being privatized, and they then subcontract to these developers to basically try to make as much money off of social housing, off of the assets that they have, and so this company. It was a very large, magnificent social housing building called the Balfron Tower. And they basically, all the tenants were evicted, and then they did this program inviting artists to live in the building for free. And this was part of this scheme by the developers to basically make the wider neighborhood more attractive. It seemed, and then I talked to a few artists who live in the building, and it was, they were fully aware of what was happening, but just like everyone else, they're struggling to find rent, and they're struggling to find a place where they can practice their art. And so it was really, it was really a very obvious scheme by the developers to acknowledge the power that art has in kind of shaping the value as seen by, like from the eyes of real estate, like the kind of profit that can be made from a neighborhood by taking advantage of art and artists. So yeah, it was just kind of like I think that's becoming increasingly obvious, where developers become quite good at manipulating and using those tools as a way to sell what they want, what they have.
Yeah, and just on that note, I took a quick moment to take a look at the Fight for Beauty website, and the opening line is, too often beauty is mistaken as a luxury, a commodity, or an accessory. We have never seen beauty as anything less than essential. And it's sort of framed in this conversation of building cities, building culture, and using this to do that. So I think that's a really interesting juxtaposition, considering there's already a culture in these spaces. There's already a history in this space, in these spaces, and there's already beauty in this space. So it's, for whom are we doing these developments, and to whom are we targeting, and to whom are we marketing? It's a really striking conversation, and I too really appreciated the arc of Gabor's arc in the film, because so often I think we think about gentrification as something that affects the millennial generation, and it certainly, perhaps disproportionately affects that generation. But there are long-time residents of these neighborhoods that have perhaps never felt the need to buy. Perhaps that's just not in their worldview, or for whatever reason, it doesn't really matter. But those who have contributed for so long to a space, to the culture, and to the history, and really kind of created or contributed to community, can just be displaced so easily, and sort of have their life changed or moved in another direction, and perhaps by consequence their art move in another direction. I thought that was a really interesting kind of parallel to make. I think there's a couple of moments in the film that actually really struck me, kind of to move from that conversation. There was a moment where Aita had said something along the lines of, "We've always been here, so I'm claiming my space here." And in another place in the film, you, Lulu, had said, "Well, I don't feel I belong anywhere else, so I'm going to fight to stay here." And I think those are such powerful statements to make when there are these seemingly insurmountable forces. Developers in Toronto are an insurmountable force, certainly. It feels like they're kind of running the city in that sense. And there's all kinds of reasons, but that's a thesis or a dissertation, and I'd be happy to talk about that another time. But it kind of, to me, feels like, you know, we need to aggressively claim our space if we're going to stay here in these cities and in these spaces that we've kind of made our home and contributed to, and feel that we belong to, because the narrative of the city is such, right? I mean, Toronto markets itself as a diverse place. Certainly it is. And that sense of belonging can't be replicated in other places necessarily, for some of us who are maybe more precarious, but even those of us who are perhaps cis, hetero, white, there's really a sense of you've built a life, and these sort of forces that displace you. I wonder if you could speak a little bit more to those moments that happened in real time. You know, when Aita was talking about her claiming her space and being there, and if you could expand a little bit more on your feeling that sense of belonging in the neighborhood and wanting to fight to stay, and maybe if you can, a little bit to the community and their fight a little bit more. I also will say I thought it was so interesting that there was that one holdout, that one guy who wouldn't sell. That's such a Toronto thing to do. But I thought that was so interesting. And if you want to speak a little bit more to that, of course, feel free.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess at the end of the film, you know, I'm talking about my thoughts, and it was actually after I had screened a rough cut to some doc friends of mine to get some feedback on, and we were just having this talk about like, yeah, like, why do we fight so hard to live in a city that's unaffordable? And it's like, yeah, as like a BIPOC queer person, it's like, you know, if I could find this like safety or like feeling of some sort of belonging in a smaller town, then yeah, it probably would be easier to just go in and move somewhere else. But just like the fact that, like, you know, in the small towns, like, I don't want to be stared at. I want to have like a queer space where my friends can like go hang out at, and I want to feel like I have my community there. And so I feel like, yeah, we're like fighting so hard to stay in Toronto because it's like there's not many other places that we'd feel welcome or comfortable staying in. What I think is amazing about Aita's story is, like, you know, when gentrification happens, most of the times it's like the marginalized folks that get pushed out first. But in the film, like, most of the people who are like older white artists, they actually, like, you know, leave. But Aita is able to like just stay there, like stand her ground. And she, I think, was one of the only people who actually like sort of like, yeah, like claimed a seat at the table with the developers, and like was able to actually like sort of work with the developers in a way, because the space that she's currently renting across the street. Actually, the retail space belongs to the developers. And then the city ended up buying my building back from the developers. And then so now ITA is going to move into that building, which was my old apartment. That's a city-owned building now. And so I think it's just so interesting that she was able to like fight to stay in the block. And when she was telling me the story about, you know, when she found out that it was being sold and trying to find a new space, she was just like, every day she would just like pace around and try and like figure out on the block where she could find a space. And I just think that Bloor and Bathurst area is so interesting because I didn't know about the legacy of the Black community that was there, but there's like barbershops that are still there, and they've been there for so many years. And the Black like newspaper Contrast magazine that was there, it no longer exists, but I was able to go through these archives and like go through the microfilm and like try and find archival footage from the area from back in like the 70s and 80s, and being able to like find that footage and how difficult it was to find the footage, I think really speaks to the fact that like a lot of like BIPOC communities, their histories aren't being archived. And so I'm happy that I was able to find that footage and also put it in this to help hopefully carry that on, and also film ITA to like carry on that archive of like BIPOC voices. But I think the whole area, like there's this whole nuanced part of how complex it was, because the annex where it is a very rich white neighborhood, and right beside it is Koreatown, and like, you know, obviously ripple effects of gentrification, who knows what's going to happen. I'm sure like that corner is going to get redeveloped in no time now, but yeah, it's like the people who would attend the community consultation meetings, it's usually people who are homeowners who like can attend a 7 p.m. meeting. And generally like the ones that I saw there were actually like white and older. And so it is interesting about who actually made up the neighborhood. And what I found was also interesting is like Mirvish Village. I don't know what kind of succession plan there would have been, but a lot of people who actually were had studios there had them for like 40 plus years. And what I was wondering about is just like, how would the new generation of like maybe younger BIPOC artists get spaces in there if Mirvish Village had kept going? And so the whole thing was a very complex thing to think about of like who's actually living in the space, and also like what's going to happen to the future of it.
Thank you. Yeah, just I think about claiming space a lot, right? And those were really powerful moments in the film. So kind of speaking to that struggle, but also that resilience. So it was really heartening to see Aita's story. I'm wondering if we can also move, and I'll open this up to both of you, but also I think we can open it up to audience questions now, because this is a good kind of segue. I think there's, you know, in the film you also touch on the question of how we frame affordability when it comes to housing. And there was a fairly recent development in January. The feds put 200 million into, was it 200 million? I think it was into the project to add a few more housing units that were framed as affordable, but sort of that 30% of median income, which was actually 80,000 per year, meaning 2,000 per month. And there was a bit of that conversation around, you know, how we actually think of what is affordable in a city like Toronto, where it's increasingly difficult to find a place to live or to find the funds to purchase a home, and kind of thinking about, you know, a growing group of folks that are considered to be working poor, you know, tend to be working 2 or more jobs, and how we're actually using public funds to help that group of people. And, you know, I think it's an interesting moment too. I think just to honor the moment that we're in the midst of a pandemic. By all accounts, we're gearing up for a reasonable economic crisis, and likely that gap between rich and poor will continue to grow. There's a shrinking middle class, you know. And I think Dr. Cohen in the film made a really good point about what are the policy tools that we're actually using to work on this problem. And I think we're going to have quite a struggle upon us after, you know, emerging hopefully one day from this lockdown. And I'll leave you kind of with a really big question, not that it can be answered in this space necessarily, but, you know, thinking about what we need to do as a society. How do we need to continue to be vigilant, and what do we need to do as citizens of these communities, whether we're homeowners or not, whether we're property owners or not? What do we need to do to keep our communities going and to keep them livable and affordable? And what does that actually mean for us as a society? And this is not just a Toronto problem, right? Oftentimes we think about it as a Toronto problem. It's not. Like, everyone is being touched by this. Montreal, Erin spoke to, and perhaps Erin, you can speak a little bit more to this. Certainly in Ottawa, that's becoming an issue as well. You know, so I'll open up the floor, obviously to you, Lulu, and to you, Erin, first, and then we'll maybe take some feedback and questions from the audience. But a big question I'm leaving you with, I know. But, you know, what do you think? Like, what do you think we need to do as communities? What have you seen in your experiences?
I feel like this question is like my big question that I was trying to answer in the film, and obviously ended up just posing more questions at the end of the film. And luckily, I was actually able to have a discussion with David Holchansky and Cheryl Case, who are Cheryl Case is an urban planner, and David Holchansky is a prof at U of T for urban planning, and knows a ton about affordable housing. And so we had a Zoom chat, and then we made it into an article for the CBC. And in that, I was just trying to ask them, like, yeah, like how do we solve this? And I think, you know, key points they talked about was like mobilizing and like community activism, and also I think just sort of like trying to figure out how to get these developers to work with us and communities a bit more. But yeah, this idea of like what is affordable, and how like at city level there's like a definition for affordable housing, and then like I guess federally maybe there's another definition for affordable housing, but like all of this affordable housing is generally like for 30 years, and like 25 of that is like the actual amount of years, and 5 years is to get from that affordable amount back to market rate kind of thing. And so that in itself, I'm just like, I just don't understand how it's like, why is there such a short period of time for this? And also just the definitions just don't really make sense to me. And, you know, some people I talked to, they were like, oh, well, if, you know, it's like the Canadian Mortgage Housing Corporation defines, you know, the market rate at, say, this amount, and like for the city of Toronto, it's 80% of that set calculated amount. That is what is considered affordable housing. And that actually ended up being better than sort of like an income-based sort of definition of affordability, because the income-based one was based on the median household income, which doesn't make sense. And so, you know, some people might be like, oh, like 1,000 something for a 1-bedroom apartment, like that's affordable. Like obviously that's way less than like what most of Toronto is paying, but I'm like, that's not affordable for like a large amount of the population. It's like this idea that someone gets to define it this way. I'm like, I think we just have to redefine what affordability is. But also I realize, making the film, it's a huge political issue. It's like there's 3 layers of government and they don't work together. And when they do work together, they could actually do something more. But, like the provincial government, they took away rent control in 2018 for Toronto. And there was like a recent bill like for evicting people too during COVID. And so it's just like, what's happening there and what can we do? And municipally, like there was supposed to be inclusionary zoning, which would have made it so that developers had to put in affordable housing in every development, but that kind of got scrapped by the provincial government, or they made it difficult. And so I'm like, how do we get that back? That wouldn't solve everything, but at least, it would give the city some sort of like way to penalize developers rather than just give them like an incentive to do something. But I think for me, that's like sort of what I learned. And, in Toronto, we have like the Encampment Support Network, which is like doing really great things. But, they're trying to help build shelters, temporary shelters like on city property. And like the city is like, no, you can't do this, and trying to stop people from doing it. So it's just like, how do we sort of feel like we have some efficacy in all of this? And I'm not sure, but I think that like obviously things need to change, and we all need to mobilize and not just complain about it, but try and like do something about it.
Yeah, I think there's certainly a large paradigm shift that needs to happen in the way that we do policy when it comes to this. I think it's almost as though, in the case of Toronto at least, there's this dependency on developers to build the supply of housing, it seems. And this has kind of roots back in sort of cuts in budget and funding, and we can get into that, or folks can read about that, read about Mike Harris on your own time. But these numbers around the cost of housing, the increased cost of housing, the decrease of vacancy rate, and the increased rental demand, these are not numbers that are separate from each other, right? These are very indicative. These are correlated numbers that are not just because of increased population or densification of spaces. This is speaking to a much larger socioeconomic problem that we have nationally, certainly. And I think, and this was mentioned in the film, increased supply does not equal affordability, right? Just because we have the tools in place to create, mixed income housing, where a certain allotment is towards rent geared to income or affordable in air quotes units, that's not going to solve the problem. We need a fulsome approach towards this. And I think we're in a situation now where we've been so behind the ball on this, on addressing the need for social housing, for example, that there's a lot of catching up that needs to happen. Erin, I'll punt it over to you. Maybe you want to speak a little bit about the work that's happening in Montreal and some of those policy tools that are available to us.
Yeah. Well, I think one question is like, what is affordability? And I think it's never going to be affordable as long as housing is a means of profit. Like, housing needs to be taken out of the market. Because as soon as you let investors control housing, they're going to try to squeeze as much profit out of it. That could be now, or that could be 30 years in the future. So I think that's part of the reason why the housing movement in Montreal is pushing so hard for social housing. And we had a very amazing victory in Park Extension, a long fought victory, where there was a large building kind of in the center of the neighborhood, or not literally at the center of the neighborhood, but for the community it was, because it's right next to the metro where a lot of community groups were housed, that was then sold to a developer. And just a few months ago, after years and years and years of pressure from the community, the city has bought over the building and is going to turn it into social housing, which has been a really amazing victory, because that was the main demand, one of the main demands that people have been fighting for. At the same time, I think there's maybe, I forget exactly how many units that they're planning. It's maybe 60 units or something like that. And that's just not enough. We need just massive amounts of housing that allow people to stay in the neighborhood. And the thing is, I think we're kind of like stuck in a mentality, or politicians at least are, that we depend on developers, but that's not necessarily the case when you look at other cities, like a city like Vienna, where I think around 70% of the population lives in, I think, cooperative housing. And in Singapore, basically, if you're from Singapore, you have the right and access to housing as well. So it's not a weird thing to supply, to give people the right to housing. It's actually done all over the place, and Canada does have the capacity to do it. But then also I think, and this is something that your movie shows so well, is that when we talk about, what is it to have a home, it's not just about housing, but it's also about, about looking beyond housing, and not, let's say, that was turned into social housing, you'd still be in an area where people don't have access to resources, where all the community spaces that they used to go to are gone, where the parks are criminalized. And that's what I saw happening in St. Henry, where it is actually a neighborhood that has a huge amount of social housing. But as the old diners are disappearing, as a lot of the space, not disappearing, being evicted, as those spaces are being shut down, a lot of the low income community basically is increasingly isolated, increasingly is less able to survive. And I think that's kind of something that we, people assume, Shazma and I were talking about this yesterday, where people say, oh, well, they'll just find somewhere else to live. But for a lot of people, working class people, especially people in marginalized communities, migrants, where you live, you know everyone in the street. You get your neighbor to take care of your kid if you go to work. You hear about everything that you need to know about how to get healthcare from your neighbors, from your acquaintances on your block. It's totally destructive to just assume people can be rooted out of their community and then plop somewhere else. And now we're starting to see where cities are becoming inaccessible to working class people, and people are having to move to the suburbs. But we've had so much of what is in the city is a lot of the services that low income communities rely on. So when they go to the suburbs, they lose all the access to clinics, drop-in centers, mental health support. They lose all of that access. So that's another aspect, is not just seeing it as just housing, which is extremely important, but also as all aspects of life, which are part of the gentrification issue.
And we actually have a great audience question here from Sanjay that I wanted to read out loud, because it kind of ties really well with what you were talking up until this moment. So Sanjay's writing, I wonder about gentrification in relation to capturing white people's imagination. I see quick mobilization in downtown adjacent neighborhoods because these are spaces seen as worthy by often privileged downtown folks. What do we make of BIPOC places with less cachet, possibly more stigmatized, like for example in the suburbs? How can we honor and safeguard those places? So if you can maybe share your thoughts about that. Thank you, Sanjay, for the question.
Yeah, if I can maybe contextualize a little bit and jump off from Erin's point, I'll just say it's also not enough to simply build social housing. We must also upkeep the housing. What we saw in Toronto, particularly around these social housing neighborhoods that were sold off to developers, was that they were highly criminalized. They were not kept up with, to the point where, you know, the buildings were falling apart, and there was no investment. There was a disinvestment in these neighborhoods, such that, you know, a developer like, I won't name names, but a developer can come in and basically snap up these properties, build condos, and then say, well, you know, you'll be displaced for a little while, but we're going to have a few affordable housing units, and some of you will be able to come back or buy back. And these are the options that we're giving, to just speak to Erin's point about housing being a right, not a privilege for building profit. So just to contextualize that, and also to say that, you know, cities have historically been hubs for migrants and for marginalized folks. And it's because, you know, the suburbs have always been seen as kind of middle class or upper class, generally cis hetero white spaces. Whereas the actual city was not traditionally seen that way. And we've seen a shift in that, right? So sort of this influx back into the city, and these spaces being revitalized to build bigger profits. It's a really great question that you ask, though, particularly around spaces in the suburbs that are also occupied by marginalized folks, and I'm sure facing kind of the impact of increased real estate valuations. I don't know, Erin or Lulu, if you who wants to go first, but I'll cede my time.
Go ahead, Lulu.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I feel like you should go, and you probably know more.
I'll just say, like, yeah, I think that's such a great question. I think one thing is that, yeah, just to say what's clear is that the suburbs are no longer white middle class spaces. This has been changing the last few decades, especially in places like the GTA, in the suburbs of Vancouver, in Montreal increasingly as well. Suburbs are multi-ethnic and migrant spaces. And also, yeah, so I think this caricature of the suburbs is no longer really valid. At the same time, I think as progressive types, maybe a lot of activism is focused often on the center of the city. You know, you protest downtown, you focus, you do interventions downtown. A lot of people go to work downtown, but we don't quite yet, like, I don't think people who organize around housing issues have really started to grapple with this adequately. I think one thing is really starting to, yeah, supporting movements, supporting people organizing in the suburbs, supporting building links with communities who are in the suburbs, who then also have links in the inner city. I think that's one thing. Yeah, I don't know. I'll leave it there.
Yeah, if anyone's interested, particularly in the Toronto case, about reading about this flip of the city versus the suburbs, David Holchansky has a really interesting report that he wrote. It was in 2010 that it was published, called "The Three Cities Within Toronto," and it basically outlines the trends that you're seeing, where you know, traditionally you may have seen poverty kind of closer to the core of the city, and now increasingly being pushed out farther and farther and farther into the burbs of the city. And so it's a really interesting question that we need to start grappling with and thinking about, because these are long-term trends, certainly.
Great. Allow me to jump in here. I just want to remind everyone that is watching our live stream on Zoom, YouTube, and Big Bad Facebook as well, that the film, the feature length version of the film is still available for free streaming on the Cinema Politica On Demand Vimeo channel until tomorrow, I believe, at 12 p.m. So if you didn't manage to see the film before tonight's live stream discussion, you can still do so later or tomorrow morning. And Sinjan is thanking everyone for the responses. We have a little bit more time if people would like to ask some questions. Now's the time. Please don't be shy. You can do so on Facebook or YouTube, or again in the webinar. And of course, I'm sure our guest speakers will be happy to answer them. But while we're waiting, I just want to bring one question to Lulu. And just since, you know, we're a political cinema film series and we screen a lot of documentaries, we can't help but wonder, you know, why did you choose documentary as a vehicle to critically explore that issue, Lulu? What was it about you know, documentary that really resonated with you? And also, if you can maybe speak up a little bit about what's next for you in terms of your filmmaking career, that'd be amazing.
So I actually did an undergrad in political science and visual arts, and then somehow I think like one of my profs like also was a part of this MFA program that I did, and I started in photo and was like, I want to go and photograph and like work for an NGO and stuff, and then discovered film. And I feel like film is like so powerful, and just the way you can tell a story, but also like do it in a respectful way where you can let other people tell their own stories, kind of thing. I think that's important for me to look at, like where I guess I stand as a filmmaker behind the lens. And I know there's like the whole power dynamics and trying to be respectful for having other people be able to tell their own stories. And I think that it had been many years since I graduated from my MFA program, and I actually was working in advertising and selling my soul. And then sort of this was all happening around me, and I realized, you know, like Mirvish Village was so special, and if no one was going to document what was happening, then future generations wouldn't get to see sort of what once existed. And I didn't plan on making a film at the beginning. I was just like, I just need to archive all of this. And then as everything started unfolding around me, I just was like, oh, this is like a story that I could never write. And this is amazing how interconnected all of it is. And I always knew I wanted to explore like redevelopment and not just make a film about Honesteds, because that would have been too big of a task with too many people having like very high expectations on how to pay homage to like something that was so important to everybody. But I thought what was the most interesting part of everything was just like using this as a microcosm to examine like how our cities are changing, and like how do we reconcile like our history and like the places that once meant so much to us with the fact that we're going through a housing crisis. And I'm still wondering how do we have both, and like who gets to decide what we keep and like what gets changed and redeveloped. And I know for a lot of friends, you know, like you move away, they moved away from the city and then they come back and they can't recognize like the city they're from, or Toronto. And so I guess like I just fell into making this documentary, and I'm really glad that I was able to tell the story, but let other people like tell their own stories.
Amazing. And what are you working on right now? What are we looking forward to?
Yeah, I have a few other docs like in development, but one of them I think is pretty much a go. And so I'm just working on sort of doing research on it, sort of about like queer history of Toronto kind of thing. And, you know, like I think also incorporating what's happening with COVID and the loss of spaces. Like we're seeing so many of, like I'm seeing so many of my favorite like queer spaces and just general spaces disappearing in Toronto because of COVID and because of how expensive like commercial rent is. And so that's sort of next. And I'm shooting on a doc series right now, and we're almost done. And then I'm shooting on another doc web series about death.
Really cool. So I do have some actually quite amazing audience questions here. So I'll start with the first one from Lucas. Hi all, thank you for your reflections so far. What scares me about all of this is how much progressive planning doctrines like transit-oriented development and public realm improvement levies, Section 27 in Toronto, I think, ridiculous neighborhood rebranding. All these threaten established communities by accelerating developer speculation. Lulu, did you speak with city planners? Were they all happy with the outcome at Bathurst and Bloor? Was Mike Layton actually pleased with the outcomes? And Lucas is also saying that it's kind of troubling that it takes an icon like Honest Eds to provoke this much attention to a block. Very few parts of the city have that kind of attention anchor, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting that it really was this one block that got so much attention. Because like, you know, you see so many of these redevelopment proposal signs like scattered across Toronto, and no one, I feel like, cares about, like no one's talking about them. You know, there's community consultation meetings for every sort of like rezoning that's happening. And, you know, like I realize I myself have not gone to many other ones. Like I was following one in Chinatown, but like in general, I haven't gone to them. And I think a lot of people in Toronto don't go to them and don't sort of like read up about it or voice their concerns. And you know, like with this development, like the city is like, I think, quite happy with what they got, in that they ended up getting concessions. Like it wasn't as high, like the buildings weren't as high, and they did end up getting their like community space and like a public park and a few other things. And like compared to most other developments in Toronto, this is definitely a better development. But if this is the bar we're setting, then like, does that say something about our city and what we should feel like we deserve? And I feel like, yeah, like, I don't know. I think with other planners, like they're also very happy with what was achieved here as well. And maybe I think with people who are working within the system, it's like you're trained to have different expectations and to figure out how to like work within the system. But then I think talking to like artists and people who are like organizing and mobilizing, like they're trying for things that are like way bigger and out of the box. And even when I was like talking to them, I was like, oh wow, like I feel like I've slipped into this idea of like, let's work within the system and have lower expectations, because like you'll never get to achieve all these other things kind of thing. But like maybe we need to think bigger and like try for things that people, you know, within the system and like the city and planners and like developers are like, that's, you know, unachievable kind of thing.
And then there's another question here from Ali. Lulu, were there any useful insights about how to pressure administrations to pressure developers while you were following Mike Layton?
Well, I think like, you know, through community consultations, I think having like, you know, I was following and briefly a part of Friends of Chinatown, who are an organization trying to get change to happen in the Chinatown in Toronto. And it's like making a lot of buzz. I think like the media is your friend in that, you know, I think, you know, we as like citizens and like smaller organizations don't have the money or the power that big corporations and developers have. But it's like, if you can generate that media, like I feel like, you know, large corporations and developers, they don't want to look bad in the media. So I think putting pressure through, you know, the media could help, but also like going to community consultation meetings and like writing to your city councilor, you know, like if you're a constituent, you're the one who's going to be electing or not electing them. So trying to put pressure on that. I think our ways.
Great, thank you. And there is one last question from the audience here before I guess we wrap up for tonight. It's an interesting question. It's really about language. So Yu Liang is saying, I noticed that you unanimously use the vocabulary revitalization, and I started to wonder the words that people commonly use interchangeably: urban revitalization, renewal, regeneration. What do you feel about the differences among these words? Also, just want to thank Lulu for making this doc. It has become my favorite documentary ever.
What?
So that's a question for all of you, I guess, about the language we're using around these projects. And maybe what kind of sentiments or ideas does this language mobilize, and how can we subvert that?
Well, I mean, I'm not going to answer because I feel like I'll let the experts take that one. But thank you so much for saying that about the documentary. And I'm like, that's too kind about how much you enjoyed it. So thank you.
Aaron, I have thoughts, but do you want to take this one on?
Yeah, just I think it's a really good question. I prefer to use the word gentrification in general. I think revitalization, renewal, renovation, they all kind of tend to be depoliticized, but gentrification has this, from the start, it was a term that was proposed as a way to draw attention to the class aspects of what's happening. It's not always used that way. There's a lot of people, when they hear it, they say, oh yeah, that's good, right? But in general, I think it points to the inequality and the hierarchy and the displacement that it can often involve.
Shazma, you said you had some thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think Aaron sums it up really, really well, right? It's like, it's the language that we use to what end, right? People have to confront it when it's gentrification. Gentrification by definition means it's exclusive. Whereas when you say revitalization, there is a promise or a perceived promise of exactly that, of benefit. But in practice, that doesn't happen. Communities get displaced, and certain groups benefit, others don't. So yeah, language is important, certainly. Thank you for that question.
Okay, well, just when I thought things are getting quieter here, we received a couple of more questions, and I still see that we have like 5 or 6 more minutes, so I'll throw them in there, and feel free to respond to either one. There is a question from Dee. I've been wondering of how redistribution of funding, supporting shelters, volunteering can help with these gentrification issues when it comes to living in the now every day during this pandemic. If we are meant to create more social housing opportunities, what would your advice be on how to respect those marginalized community spaces and create opportunities that build culture surrounding the area, so it does not become more gentrified by investors or those buying out the condos to live elsewhere? So this is the question from Dee. And there is a follow-up from Lucy Earl. Hi all, thanks for your thoughts thus far. Just a follow-up based on Lucas's question. Community consultations routinely attract the same types of residents and individuals, demographically speaking. How can we make these bottom-up opportunities for community insights more accessible? So please pick either one of those questions to respond to, and then I guess we will wrap up the evening.
So do we want to maybe start with the redistribution of funding question, supporting shelters? I think this is a conversation that groups in Toronto have been trying to have for a long time. Lucas mentioned there are sections in the Planning Act referring to community benefit. There arguably needs to be updates to the Planning Act to allow us to actually hold developers to account when it comes to community benefit. There's kind of this running joke in Toronto that, you know, community benefit to a developer effectively means a parquet, which is like a small little triangle in the corner of a block. And you know, just also to your point about transit-oriented planning along key transportation lines, we've had a hard time using the policy tools available to us, holding developers to account for supporting infrastructure kind of wholesale. There's improvements, there's some positive stories that have kind of happened, but on the whole, I think this is a really challenging question that lies in how we utilize the tools that are available to us from a policy perspective. And that's an ongoing conversation, I think. And I'm not sure, Erin, if you want to, if you know more about the Montreal case and what the city has done here. But I know that in Toronto, these are ongoing conversations. So definitely we'll keep up with that and sort of see where that goes. It kind of links into also the conversation around police budgets and redistributing those funds elsewhere, but takes us in a maybe another direction.
Yeah, I think, I mean, both questions are a bit related. It's like, how do you support and support communities and ensure that developers are held accountable? There's a huge amount of tools. Personally, I think, you know, as individuals, the best tool is to go and support tenants who are organizing, and to, you know, there's a lot of organizations like tenants unions who need support, financial, you know, will always not say no to, you know, if you want to hand out flyers or stuff like that. It's like very likely that there's an organization like that in your neighborhood. And I think that's maybe like, as an individual, one of the best ways you can help out is by supporting existing movements on the ground. And also, I think for cities and municipalities as well, it's, you know, there are in Montreal, there's housing committees in every neighborhood that get funding from the city to basically support tenants to fight their landlords. You know, that's something that needs to be supported more. And all these organizations are lacking in funding and resources. I think it's like a really, you know, just $5,000 for an organization like that makes a huge difference. But when we're talking about real estate, we're talking about millions and millions of dollars, you know? So if these developers were really serious about, you know, community benefits, they might consider donating to tenants' rights organizations, things like that. But then there's also all these other tools. I'm personally skeptical that, you know, we should be relying on developers to you know, have the grace to give us the things that we need. And I think there are ways to push them to do that, like policy-wise. But in the end, I think there's, yeah, I think the question is, why should we be relying on a private actor to guarantee public services? Like that, to me, is the role of the public and of the municipality. And I think, you know, that's just another way of you know, avoiding that by the government often, that it's actually their responsibility to provide these things.
Thank you. And Lulu, did you have any thoughts about any of these?
I think that with like in regards to community consultations, like, you know, maybe if they provided childcare and like actually like maybe had it at a different time. And I guess the idea of maybe like if now that it's like over on like online, maybe that could help with like being more accessible. But yeah, I think just having them at different times that accommodate you know, other people would be super helpful. And for, yeah, I'm just like, it's just so hard because I'm like, this isn't my field, but I am become so interested on like what can be done to change things. But hopefully, you know, like we can rely more on our governments to actually work together and do something. And I realize, you know, a lot of people probably don't want to pay more taxes, but I'm sure if we had to pay more taxes, there'd be more money that could go into, you know, developing, you know, social housing, et cetera. But also there's a lot of unused like municipal land. And it's like, why is the city giving it away to developers? Like, why aren't they giving, like, there's like a school that's like not used anymore. Like, why can't they turn that into something more usable? Or like a city's like municipal golf course, why can't you just turn that into like housing, you know? So yeah.
Yeah, municipal priorities are odd at times. And there came one truly last fantastic question that I will dare to ask you. I hope you're not too exhausted to answer that. It is, again, quite related to what we were just talking about. And the question is from VJ. And he's asking, how do we effectively fight real estate developers and investors when municipal governments often depend on them for building tax revenue in a vicious circle? Relatedly then, what are some elements of a people's effort that that can be consolidated to fight gentrification beyond depending on the government and or the housing market to ensure affordable urban living spaces?
I will let one of you take it away.
It's a really good question, Vijay. I think we live in capitalism, and that's a really hard ball to undo. It's really tied to, the housing market is really tied to that, right? I think honestly, we don't see housing as a right, and that's a huge problem. I really think if there's a shift in culture, and this is a big ask, right? Because like we're talking about paradigm shift, but viewing housing as a right, not a privilege that someone can afford, is so essential to this. I would argue that it is the government's responsibility to provide housing for its citizens, even if you are to take capitalist logics into account. If your working class is not housed, how are they contributing to capitalism? It's a basic question, and one that I think about a lot. Yeah, it's a very complex question, and the question of funding. This is like we're undoing decades of disinvestment. So it's going to take a concerted and aggressive effort to remove or balance the power that developers have in our municipalities. And it's a big question. I don't know how to answer that.
Aaron, you have some
Yeah,
thoughts?
I think it also goes back to, who's showing up to these consultations? How can these consultations be made more accessible? What are the kinds of things that people need to be able to start, getting involved in the politics of their neighborhood? Often people don't have time. People don't have any stability in their life. They're just focusing on the people who are the most affected by gentrification are just focusing on survival and getting by in the day to day. So what is a way that we can support people in showing up and in demanding the right to housing? And I think that's kind of, we're not going to get anything unless the people who are the most affected by it are able to be part of the struggle. So yeah, I think that's kind of a question to be asking. I know that in Toronto, in Parkdale, there's been a huge tenants mobilization in recent years, and that's been really exciting to see. And it really, to me, it speaks to, your rent is a factor of how much you organize. Like if you organize with other tenants, with your neighbors, like you can win to keep rents affordable. And the fact that Montreal has rent control is purely a product of movements of the past having struggled for that. Yeah, just some thoughts.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you. I'd like to invite you to maybe share some last thoughts in conclusion of this wonderful, fascinating discussion tonight. I wish we can keep on going, but it's getting late and it's Monday night. So I'm just going to remind everyone that's still watching that you can watch There's No Place Like This Place, Any Place on Cinema Politica on demand until tomorrow. And this is the feature-length version of the film. Hopefully we'll have other opportunities to share this film with you in the future. And for that, you can also follow us on social media and sign up for our newsletter at cinemapolitica.org. And I'd like to invite our guest for maybe some closing remarks for the evening before we call it a night.
Thank you so much for having me and for putting together this panel discussion, and for everybody's thoughts, and for the audience for watching the film. And if you hadn't had a chance to watch it, please go watch it and let me know what you think, because I'm sad that I can't be in a theater with everybody watching and then getting to hear the reactions, in real time. And hopefully one day I'll get to watch this in theater with a lot of you. But yeah, just thank you so much for putting this together and putting this on.
Shazma, Aaron?
Sure, I was waiting for Aaron, but I'll go ahead. Yeah, so just to echo Lulu's words, thank you Cinema Politica and team for putting this together. It's such an important conversation to be having. And as I said at the beginning, something that really resonates, right? I mean, I think all of us are connected to gentrification in some way, shape, or form, or have been impacted by it in some way, shape, or form, or will be potentially. So thank you for that. And Lulu, thank you for a beautiful film, something that, I think stimulated really, really useful and provoking discussions. And that's a testament to your ability as a filmmaker. So thank you so much for putting that out there into the world. And I'll just echo one audience member's comments and just say that this is probably one of the best films that I've seen in a while. So so well made, so elegantly told, and of course the subject matter is close to my heart. So thank you, and I'll hand off to Aaron.
Yeah, likewise, I'm just totally grateful that I've been able to watch your movie, Lulu. It was just such a impactful story, and I'm just going to be thinking about it for such a long time. It was so vivid, and yeah, thank you.
Thank you both so much for those amazing words, and for the amazing questions that you had and your answers as well. Yeah, I hope that this film creates more discussion, and thank you both for the amazing work that you do.
Yeah, thank you all. It was really incredible to listen you converse on this incredibly important and timely topics, not just in Montreal, Toronto, but in all of our cities in Canada for sure. A huge thank you to our super duper engaged audience. I'm always amazed to see how much energy people bring to online events. This is quite inspiring, and I hope we keep it up for future events as well, or until the restrictions are lifted and we can be together again in physical spaces. I do hope that we can have you in Montreal in our venue at Concordia, of course, in the future as well. We're all looking forward to the work that you do. Please share any links on the Facebook event page, on any of your social media channels. The live stream discussion will live online from now on, and so please feel free to share with your contacts and followers. And I'd like to thank you once again very, very much. I'd like to thank to our tech support, Concordia that provided the webinar, our staff, of course, closed captioning. Thank you so much for making this event accessible tonight. And yes, follow us on social media, sign up for our newsletter for more Cinema Politica events. Thank you to our guests, and have a restful evening and a wonderful week ahead.